It is 452. The Roman domain is near the very edge of breakdown, and the Huns have quite recently sent off their assault on northern Italy. A few urban communities are totally obliterated, compelling local people to go on the run. They head for a tidal pond simply off the coast and take shelter on a few little islands, a choice that would most likely save their lives. Despite everything, this little progress ultimately proceeded to assemble one of the most great accomplishments of designing the world has at any point seen Venice. In spite of having no streets, no land, and no new water, the Venetians figured out how to transform a sloppy marsh into the most remarkable and richest city of now is the ideal time. This one-of-a-kind format of channels and extensions woven through many islands made Venice inconceivably open, and it turned into the focal point of all business. We displayed the whole thing to show you what's happening underneath the surface and how its shrewd plan and middle-aged designing permitted it to assume control over the world. At the point when the primary evacuees showed up to begin their new lives on the islands, they had the absolute worst surface to expand on. The little, muddy islands were made of an unimaginably delicate earth, which would scarcely hold the heaviness of a human, not to mention a whole city. To make stable starting points for structures, the Venetians gathered enormous wood heaps from the backwoods of Croatia and begun pounding them into the ground. They drove them around 5 meters deep until they arrived at a lot harder layer of dirt. In addition to the fact that this settled the heaps, yet by pressing them truly near one another, it compacted the encompassing dirt, pushing out the water and making it a lot more grounded. When the heaps were solidly in the ground, the tops were removed and wooden boards were laid on top to spread the heap. Exceptional blocks of Istrian stone were then positioned to raise the establishments over the water. This plan was a brilliant idea, as the wooden heaps were fixed away from the air, making it unimaginable for them to spoil. Right up till now, practically the first heaps are all in extraordinary condition and are, as yet, holding up the city. When the establishment had been appropriately set out, the actual structures were fabricated. Venetians got going involving wood for their homes. Yet after various flames, they changed to block. To keep the structures as lightweight as could be expected, they must be something like 3 stories high. Lime mortar must be utilized rather than concrete, since it was adaptable and would permit the whole structure to flex as the ground underneath leisurely moved. The inward walls were inherent a confused design that would likewise flex like a lattice. The veneer walls, which had huge windows and rich stone plans, made them a lot heavier. Thus, to prevent them from falling over, they were stuck into the floor utilizing iron bars, holding the whole structure together. This strategy for building functioned admirably for the Venetians, and soon a few islands around the tidal pond were laid out along these lines. Rather than extending outwards, as most urban areas, these islands ventured into one another. From the outset, boats were the best way to cross between the islands. However, in the long run, the islands developed nearer together, and many could be gotten by essentially swimming through the shallow water on a pony. The subsequent stage in Venice's advancement would obviously be associating the islands. Shockingly, there were no extensions for the first 500 years of Venice's presence. Be that as it may, as the populace expanded and business began to increase, there should have been a simpler method for arriving at Rialto, the monetary focus of Venice. Thus, the Doge of Venice set up an award for the specialist that could plan the best scaffold. To divert Venice from an assortment of islands into a clamoring city, spans must be fabricated. The main endeavor was a basic barge span that joined the 2 biggest segments of Venice together and urgently gave speedy admittance to the Rialto region. The scaffold was subsequently moved up to a wooden extension, which in the long run burned to the ground and imploded before it was at last supplanted by a lot more grounded stone extension. To construct it, more than 12,000 lumber heaps were crashed into the banks of the trench, and 10,000 tons of stone were based on top to shape the scaffold. Right up till now, the extension actually stands, and it fills in as the primary course in the focal point of Venice. After this, stone extensions began to spring up all over the place, transforming Venice into a minimized city made up completely of waterways rather than streets. This gave Venice a one-of-a-kind benefit, since the trenches permitted products and traffic to stream rapidly through all aspects of the city. The untidy crossover of people on foot and pony-attracted traffic didn't exist in Venice, since the walkways and trenches were totally isolated. However, individuals could progress between the two easily, without dialing back. At this point, the city had turned into the most remarkable and most extravagant city in Europe. Everything being traded went through Venice, and the Venetians were bringing in colossal measures of cash. However, as business expanded, so did the populace, and the interest for new water was crazy. In spite of being encircled by water, Venice couldn't utilize any of it, since it was very pungent and undrinkable. Without regular springs or streams to gather new water, Venice depended upon boats to convey water from the central area. However, with 170,000 individuals, the interest turned out to be excessively, and the Venetian specialists needed to get innovative. All along, Venetian islands were worked around squares, which were at first void fields for creatures to munch upon. The thought was to utilize these squares to gather water. They began by recovering enormous regions under the whole square and fixing the walls with a thick layer of dirt to make it waterproof. The space was then filled in with sand and stones, and the surface was revamped with tiles that would lead the water towards each side of the square. From here, water would stream into the bowl and steadily channel through the sand and stones until it arrived at the primary well at the focal point of the square. To amplify the surface region for water assortment, the tops of the close-by structures were fitted with drains that would coordinate the water onto the square and into the channels. Venice then turned into a colossal pipe, which filled in excess of 600 wells around the city. Yet again, the Venetians had designed a magnum opus to save its city, yet there was as yet one tremendous issue: squander. Until this point, individuals tossed all of their loss through of the window, some of it arriving in the trench. Be that as it may, for the people who didn't live inside tossing distance of a waterway, pee, dung, and spoiled food all wound up in the roads. Thus, in the 16th 100 years, the Venetians began building an organization of underground passages that would gather the loss from each structure and flush it into the trench. At the point when the tide of the tidal pond was down, strong waste would gather at the base and the fluids would normally stream into the channels. Then, at that point, when the tide rose, it would flood the passages and maneuver the strong waste into the trench. All the movement of the tide coming in and out 2 times every day would trade the messy water or new water from the ocean, flushing Venice from its waste. The very pungent water functioned as serious areas of strength for A, and because of this framework, the roads turned out to be spotless. Incredibly, practically the staggering designing that made Venice is all still around today. The extensions, the waterways, the structures are old relics, sitting on a woodland that has held up the whole city.